All right, welcome everybody. We are pleased to bring you another free 90-minute webinar today from Desert Waters Correctional Outreach entitled The Shaking Before the Fall, Understanding Suicide Risk. As we are recording today's presentation, please keep yourselves muted. I am Justin Stevens, Desert Waters Chief Operating Officer and Master Instructor. Desert Waters is a nonprofit established in Colorado 22 years ago. Our mission is to improve the well-being of corrections and other public safety professionals through training, consulting, and other essential resources to foster resilience, mental health, and overall wellness in these challenging professions. Please visit us at desertwaters.com to learn more about what we do. And if you like these free webinars, please take a moment out of your busy schedule to follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn. Today's presenters are Doctors Katerina Spinaris and Joe Zano. Katerina Spinaris is the executive director and founder of Desert Waters Correctional Outreach and a licensed professional counselor. Her professional experience includes developing wellness curriculum from correctional staff and their family members, training thousands of staff, treating correctional staff and their family members, and conducting research on staff wellness. She originated the term corrections fatigue, and one of the courses she authored, From Corrections Fatigue to Fulfillment, received the 2016 Commercial Product Award of Excellence by the International Association of Corrections Training Personnel. She designed the Corrections Fatigue Assessment, helped develop the Safety Net Accreditation Program for correctional staff wellness, and has authored and co-authored 4 books on correctional staff wellness. Katerina is convinced that there can be no true criminal justice reform without staff wellness, and no enduring staff wellness without criminal justice reform. That is why she is an ardent believer in the importance of pursuing both with equal fervor and determination. And Joe Zano is a clinical psychologist with a passion for the wellness of all first responders. He retired from the Federal Bureau of Prisons in 2024 after 22 years of service, and now serves as a wellness advisor and master instructor at Desert Waters Correctional Outreach. Joe's experience in the BOP spans all security levels, and he has held numerous positions there, including deputy chief psychologist and administrator of civil commitment and treatment program for sexually dangerous persons. He also served as a member of the Federal Correctional Complex in Florence, Colorado, disturbance control team for nearly a decade. Joe has firsthand knowledge of the effects of repeated exposure to direct and indirect trauma, as well as other chronic stressors uh, unique to the correctional workers and first responders. Joe believes establishment of a healthy work culture and environment through a focus on wellness breeds not only trauma and stress resilience, but a safer, more efficient, and more effective workforce. So, with that introduction, I'm going to hand it over to Joe. Joe, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone, and hello to anybody who is joining us on the YouTube channel after this is recorded. First and foremost, I just want to put out there just sort of as an expectations management piece while Justin is getting our slideshow up and running. Some people may see a corrections-oriented training that's about suicide and automatically assume that we're going to be talking about inmate suicide prevention or suicide prevention for incarcerated individuals, because that's commonly what we talk about in corrections. That is not necessarily what we're doing here today. If you're new to Desert Waters or you're not familiar with who we are and what we do, we are here to serve the brave men and women who serve as corrections professionals and other public safety professionals. So when we are talking about understanding and reducing suicide risk through this fluid vulnerability theory, we're talking specifically about staff suicide prevention. So I just wanted to get that on the table to begin. The second thing I want to say before we advance is that we just really appreciate the fact that you took time out of your day to be here. It's not easy to find 60 or 90 minutes to attend a webinar. I'm willing to bet you find this useful and hopefully have some practical things you can sort of take back to your facilities and some other stuff that you can kind of crunch on and we can go from there. So with that, let's get going. As we start, this is a tough subject. Staff suicide, I'm willing to bet, has impacted probably everybody on this presentation to varying degrees, and I think it's also possible, and I think more than possible. The research tells us it's likely, given the prevalence of suicidal thoughts among corrections professionals in particular, that somebody listening to us, whether you're joining us here live or whether you're dialed into the YouTube channel afterwards, that somebody out there is struggling with thoughts of suicide. And so we want to address that first and foremost. Please remember, you are not alone. There is hope and help out there, and it is available. Um, you know, this like I said, it's hit all of us in one way or another. And I just want you to know that reaching out is truly a sign of strength. It's not something that is weak. It is not something to be belittled. It takes courage to reach out and try to make positive change. So if you are struggling, please reach out. You can call, chat, or text 988. You can reach out to your local health providers, talk to your loved ones, your spouse, talk to somebody. So from the get-go, we want to acknowledge that and encourage you to get help and talk to someone. Number two is that this is a very emotionally activating topic. As I said, this has hit all of us one way or another. And we're not here, we don't have a magic solution. If we had the pixie dust and we could just throw it at the problem and make it go away, we would, but we don't. So what we're going to do here is we're going to attempt to talk in a way that is compassionate but real about this very, very real and very important issue. Um, and I would ask you, if you're participating, try to assume positive intent. Everybody who's on this call, everybody who's going to submit questions, everybody who's going to submit a point of view or want to talk about something, or maybe it's Katerina and I, maybe we say something that you don't agree with, you don't like. Please know we are just attempting to tell the story as we see it, provide you with some useful information that can really be used to reduce the suicide risk among the people that work in corrections and other public safety venues. And so, with that, we'll go to sort of the more traditional talking about what the objectives of the course are. Um, so what we're going to do is discuss the fluid vulnerability theory, which, credited Rudd and Brian and the work that they do. And Dr. Spinaris has come up with some really unique ways of putting it in a metaphor in a way that I think illustrates. And we're not, although there may be mental health professionals on here, this is for everybody. This is not just for mental health professionals. This is for anyone who works in, around, or near corrections or any other public safety. And so we're going to really draw it down and talk about some stuff that are relevant to public safety um, professionals as we get towards the end. So why are we going to talk about suicide risk? I don't think I have to convince anybody on here that suicide among staff members is an issue. Let's just talk about suicide in general for a second, right? Suicide is, depending on what source you look at, roughly the 17th leading cause of death in the world. In the United States, suicide is consistently ranked in the top 10 causes of death. In fact, year over year, suicide accounts for more deaths than motor vehicle accidents and homicides combined in the United States. And I found that just to be a very striking and sobering reality. And then you combine that with some of the research Desert Waters and other organizations have done that demonstrate that corrections professionals are at an increased risk for suicide when compared with the general population, but even when compared with other law enforcement agencies. And so that is how dire this is. And I think one of the most striking things I found as I was, kind of digging more into this is awareness of the suicide epidemic has skyrocketed. And despite the fact that that awareness has skyrocketed, the rates of suicide have continued to climb. Okay. And that's tragic and scary. And we need to do something to pay attention to that trend and hopefully turn that tide. And so we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about some systemic ways to hopefully address some of these issues and kind of go from there. So suicide risk is complicated. It's hard, right? You sit here and you think, well, I don't understand, that this person over here underwent some of the most horrific things that you can imagine, and they made it through just fine, yet this person chose to take their own life. And it didn't look, at least as an outsider, right, that they were carrying all that heavy of a load compared to person number one. I think we've had those thoughts. I know I have had those thoughts. It's complicated. So we're going to talk about individual differences among people, and we're going to talk about this theory and how it explains um, some of that. Why do some people make it through a horrible situation at point A, but then years later at point B, they're not able to make it through. They're not a similar or even a less, outwardly looking stressful situation, right? And so we're going to talk about the complex interaction of the risk factors for suicide. And I think the next slide will give us a good some other good questions. You know, Suicide is far from random, but it's also very hard to predict. Now, statistically, if anybody out there is statistically inclined, I think you may know that suicide is statistically a pretty rare event and therefore hard to come up with a good prediction model. I think more than the statistical reality of trying to predict suicide, there are so many variables that feed into suicide risk. And it's hard to understand why one variable affects person A, but not person B. One variable affects persons D and E, but didn't affect person B, but only affects person A if this other variable is present, right? And if that sounds complicated, that's just the beginning of the tangled web, right? So there are virtually an infinite number of risk factors that could be considered. But we're going to talk about some risk factors that are potentially specific to our population, that is the public safety professionals and staff members, and we're going to talk about hopefully some ways we can do that. The other part of this is the risk factors. You don't always see them; they're beneath the surface, and they may be long-standing and festering, or they may be in a different category of risk, right? And so let's jump to the next slide there. All right. So talking about suicide risk, one of the reasons it's so complicated it is that it is dynamic, it is fluid, it changes, and depending on the combination of the variables and the variables that are present. And if suicide risk is dynamic and not static, if it's fluid, then our vulnerability to suicide also fluctuates. It's also fluid, right? Your suicide risk is time dependent. Your vulnerability to suicide is time and circumstance dependent. And so we're going to talk about the fluid vulnerability theory in specific. And it posits that essentially there are different factors that can combine or add up to determine ultimately whether or not someone is likely to become suicidal. And so some of those risk factors, and we're going to talk about them in detail, they're going to talk about static risk factors and more dynamic short-term acute risk factors. But we're also going to talk about activating events and the role that they play. And I would ask you to keep in mind as we talk about these concepts and use the metaphor to sort of wrap your brain around what is ultimately an academic theory, but has some real world applications, is that these are different for everybody, right? And so somebody's suicide risk is more than just the sum of their risk factors. It depends on the interaction of those risk factors and the activating event. And so one of the first things we're going to do is look at the sort of the players that sort of go into suicide risk, at least as explained by this model. So the four players we're going to talk about are baseline risk, activating events, acute risk, and crisis phase. And although this is just sort of a brief introduction, we're going to certainly drill down on those. The baseline risk is going to be your more traditional, stable, long-term. Your activating event is going to be something that happens, real or perceived. And like I said, we're going to drill down on each of these. Your acute risk is more the short-term risk phase, and there are four sort of categories of factors that can kind of play into that. And we're going to talk about the crisis phase and sort of the unfortunate side of it. So without further ado, let's jump into the metaphor. So we're going to look at a structure in a storm as a metaphor for suicide risk. It's not perfect, and we could nitpick it. Um, but I think it does well at sort of illustrating this theory and how we can sort of use it to move forward. And so we're going to start with some terminology. So we talked about the four players in suicide risk, right? And so when we talk about that, we're going to talk about baseline risk, and we're going to liken baseline risk factors to termites that can actually undermine the structure, a structure, a house or another standing structure. And we're going to talk about the activating events, which we're going to call the storm. And so this is just to get terminology out of the way. The acute risk factors, which we consider the shaking that may indicate a collapse is imminent, and then the suicide crisis, which is a time-limited crisis, which is the where the acute risk of collapse happens. And so as we jump into this baseline risk and we start to look at what that refers to, baseline risk are long-term relatively fixed, they're stable vulnerabilities. Now, they are not unchangeable, but they're largely stable. So some of them we will see. You're not going to do anything to affect them. And others have changed. So it's when we traditionally look at suicide risk, we look at static factors and we look at dynamic factors. Well, what this theory posits is that these baseline risk factors aren't necessarily static, but they're long lasting. They're relatively stable. Um, and what they serve to do in this analogy is that they're like termites. If you have enough of them of enough severity, they can weaken the structure to the point where collapse is more likely with even a brisk wind, let alone a hurricane or a bigger storm. So these things, in and of themselves, are not causes of suicidal actions. Rather, they serve to undermine or increase one's long-term baseline risk. So the other thing to remember is we all have a baseline risk. Everybody who's joining us today and everybody who's looking at the recording, we all have a baseline risk. And so the next thing we're going to do is talk about some of the factors that go into our baseline risk. And so we're going to start there and just sort of look at these baseline risk factors. Um, so there are different categories. So the one is biological and physiological substrates. So genetics. Unless they have found a way to go in and manipulate and change our genetic structures, which they probably have, and I just don't know about it, this is not something that's going to change. So, to some degree, we have the cards we're dealt, right? And this is how our nervous system functions, and this can be mental illnesses that are biologically controlled, right? Bipolar disorder is one that is famous for having just a huge amount of genetic loading in terms of whether or not it's likely to be passed down. There's also historical things. So historical things, family histories of mental illness, family history of suicide. Is generally associated with a higher risk. Those are termites. Exposure to prior trauma. Well, that is not normally a static factor as we think of it, but once you've been exposed to trauma, it becomes a static factor that is woven into your baseline risk. Psychiatric diagnosis, whether they're treated or well controlled or not, whether you're receiving treatment, Then there's an emotional component. And when we're talking about emotions, we're not talking about your day-to-day, minute-to-minute reactive emotions. We're talking about chronic emotional problems. So chronic emotional dysregulation, whether that is hyperreactive emotionality, whether that is a chronically depressed emotionality or a dysthymic presentation, but those serve as sort of it's not hard to imagine why long-term emotional dysregulation would be a termite that undermines the structural integrity. The other categories include cognitive things, and so feelings different than thinking, right? And so understanding that rigid thinking patterns and rigid inflexible and largely irrational thinking patterns, right? Internalized misbelief. And there are a whole bunch of things, and we're going to talk more about this as we move forward, that can go into that. And then there are long-term behavioral issues, right? So long-term ineffective coping strategies and long-term alcohol and substance abuse. If we're going to be real, right? Corrections has an alcohol problem, right? I challenge anyone to argue with me. Yes, on an individual basis, maybe you don't have that problem, but corrections has an alcohol problem. Katerina and I were talking about this yesterday, and she told a story, and I didn't get to commiserate with her because I had a similar experience where I just asked a room full of people, "Hey, what's your primary coping mechanism?" And my top two answers, you guys can probably guess them. It was beer and bourbon, right? Those are ineffective in the short term and devastatingly dangerous in the long term as it comes to suicide risk. So that's just something to consider. History of self-injury and prior suicide attempts. Those are statistically connected to future suicide risk, and they are also they are considered long-term termites that further erode the structure. This last one is something I don't know that I put a whole lot of thought into until the past maybe 30 or 45 days as we started to prepare for this webinar and some other trainings and presentations that we're doing. But long-term insufficient or unhealthy social support can serve as a termite that will sufficiently erode your base and increase your own baseline risk for suicide. We're talking about cultural things inside of our workplace, like I'm I'm too tough to ask for help, or pain don't matter, it don't hurt, or I'll get all the sleep I need when I'm dead, or only weak people go to the sort of the huggy staff wellness thing that they've got going on over there, right? This whole notion that asking for help means you're weak is just it's absurd on its face. And I hope everyone knows that and understands that. But it can impact somebody's long-term suicide risk. And I think that is important to note as we move forward. So I hope that the at least the metaphor of these baseline risk factors eroding the structure, right, that is now going to be exposed to a storm. And for those of us who work in corrections and really any public safety or any emergency response type of field, it's not a question of if we're going to get hit by a storm, but when, right? And in terms of suicide, I would argue, and I don't like to use absolutes, right? That I guess that's the psychologist in me. I don't like to say that something always equals this or never equals this. But I'm going to go out on a limb and say I think there's always an activating event for suicide. I think there's always a storm. Now, I will qualify that by saying that activating event, that storm, it's not my opinion of how severe that storm is that matters. It's the individual who's going through the crisis. It is their perception of how severe that storm, that loss is. And this is stuff we all know and we've all seen. So some activating events, some of the more common storms that we see that are connected to eventual suicidal crises are health problems. chronic pain or devastating medical diagnoses, right? Relationships and more importantly, the loss of relationships, right? Whether it's divorce or whether it's coworkers or whether it's friends or whether it's family, finances, right? This is a fickle business. If you work in corrections, most of you who work in corrections work for a government agency. You're subject to budgetary issues. And the system I retired from, we were subject to shutdowns, overtime prohibitions. There can be financial crises that happen, right? Reputation and freedom, those two kind of go hand in hand. Things happen in a correctional environment, and when things happen and when allegations are made, we as corrections professionals have a duty to investigate those things. That's a horribly stressful thing to go through and be the subject of an investigation or to have somebody you know be the subject of an investigation. It can mean whether or not you did anything wrong, it can mean the loss of your reputation. And if you did engage in, for whatever reason, something that violated the law or somebody's civil rights, your very freedom could be jeopardized, right? And all of these are things that we have seen connected to eventual suicides in corrections and other public safety professionals. So these are the storms. Just remember, a storm might be sufficiently strong to start shaking a structure, especially if it's been weakened by more of those termites. And so let's move on to the acute phase. So the acute phase in this analogy is sort of the shaking. These are the short-term acute risk factors that increase suicide risk. They're short term, but they're intense. They can be volatile and they can change rapidly. And as the building shakes, it destabilizes. And if you follow the metaphor, the more it shakes, the more the risk of collapse increases. And so, what are we talking about when we talk about the shaking, these short term acute factors? You're going to see a lot of the same categories that we did with the baseline. So, physical stuff, right? This is short term physiological responses, nervous system dysregulation, activation of the fight, flight, or freeze response, right? These are biological imperatives. If somebody is in the middle of a storm, of a crisis, it is possible that their sympathetic nervous system, and that's the whole, your body is physiologically preparing to either fight like heck, run away, or it just shuts you down. You're either going to fight, flight, or you're going to freeze up and shut down. That's going to happen. Any one of those things has potential consequences as it relates to suicidality. There are emotional shaking, right? So the short-term acute emotional risk factors that we're looking for, panic and shame, hopelessness and despair, anger, right? Anger is in there too. That's an emotional state. And the emotional states, when they are paired with the cognitive states, can be particularly dangerous, right? So we feel shame, and then maybe we believe there's no real way out. We can't go on. I can't possibly put up with this. Or you feel like a burden. I can't ask for help. I don't want to burden somebody else for this, right? And so these things are all swirling around. And then let's throw in, a behavioral factor. Well, let's go back to alcohol and drug abuse, right? Um, let's talk about self-harm. In the short term, some individuals use self-harm as a self-regulating coping mechanism. It's not particular, it's unfortunately it's physiologically very effective, but it can be long-term very damaging. And it's hard to really wrap your brain around that. But if we see acts of self-harm, and it's not on the slide, but the other thing we see is rehearsal. And so these acute risk factors, rehearsal is one that just it screams at me, right? And I can tell you from my own experiences, having sat across the table or across a chair from someone who has described a dangerous pattern of drinking shot after shot of bourbon while loading and unloading their personal firearm. Um, and those rehearsal behaviors are some of the more obvious shaking that can really skyrocket suicide risk. So alcohol, drugs, those are all short-term behavioral consequences. Also, the short term, this is not like a pervasive lack of support or pervasive unhealthy environment. This is short term. I feel horrible, so I'm going to isolate and withdraw. I'm going to do things in secret. I'm not going to tell people about this stuff. And so that's sort of the short term piece of the social thing. The crisis phase. So what happens theoretically is, everyone's got a baseline risk, right? So your baseline risk is largely stable. It can be altered. We'll talk about that shortly. But for now, let's just assume it's a relatively stable state. And so if your baseline risk, is I wish I'm sorry, you really can't see what I'm saying, but if your baseline risk is lower, then you might have more resiliency. If your baseline risk is higher, great. Then your baseline risk is higher. It's not going to take as powerful of a storm. And then you have a storm. Like I said, the storm is going to hit. There's no doubt about it. You're going to get hit by a storm if you're a first responder. It is what it is. But that storm, that activating event, also is going to have some of these acute risk factor ripples. So it's going to be your chronic long-term baseline risk plus your storm plus your acute short-term risk. And if you reach a certain threshold, you go into what Rudd would call the suicidal mode. And that is just a conceptual term that he came up with to show that this is a usually time limited, usually thankfully brief period where you are extremely susceptible to acting on suicidal thoughts. Right. So this is the tip of the spear where the interventions by professionals need to occur. And I'd be remiss if we didn't talk briefly about why this is so dangerous in corrections professionals, law enforcement officers, first responders. What I can say is generally, we are people that possess firearms. We have them in our homes, we use them at work. We are generally firearms friendly, if you will, culture and group. And that's fine. Except what we know about suicide is that when people start to have suicidal thoughts, they start to think about the available means. How would I end my life if I chose to do so? And firearms are by far the deadliest choice. And unfortunately for us, they're also one of the most readily available choices that we have. And so we just need to understand that that part of our culture can impact risk, right? So access to firearms and access to lethal means of ending your life can be hugely important, especially in that crisis phase. So to sort of pull the metaphor together, right? Just imagine, if you will, that for somebody's suicidal mode to be activated, for that crisis phase to be activated, that they need a score of 100, right? And so any combination of termites, storm, and shaking can get you there. So you may have somebody whose baseline risk is 75, which I would consider to be extremely high, and then their short-term acute risk factors, throw another 20 on there because they've got really bad coping mechanisms and they drink alcohol to cope with anything and things of that nature. And so the storm only needs to be of a 5 intensity to push that person onto the suicidal mode. Now the hard thing to keep in mind is that there is no magic formula. These variables add up differently for each of us, right? So my 100 is not Katerina's 100, is not Justin's 100, is not any of your hundreds. These are individualized things. And so I would also argue that the score is more than the sum of its parts, right? So we see this with drug overdoses, where there is I don't know if you've ever heard of what's called a super additive effect, right? If you take alcohol and benzodiazepines, like tranquilizers or pain medication, they can have a super additive effect. So one shot of whiskey plus one pain pill is not the same as just adding those two effects together. In fact, it can exponentially increase the effects. These variables are the same. So some of the variables can be super additive, and that's especially when you come in with these behavioral variables. Alcohol, chronic sleep deprivation, short-term sleep loss, poor coping mechanisms, volatility, anger, hopelessness, helplessness. Those are the super additive ones that can really kick these variables kind of into high gear. And it varies. And we've covered that. It varies according to individuals and it varies according to people. So we all have our thresholds. So just don't look at this as, oh, I need to figure out what 100 is. Just sort of try to understand that any combination of baseline risk, acute risk, and the strength of the storm can push somebody into the suicidal mode. Why does this matter? Why are we sitting here talking about in what is largely an academic theory, and right, and so yeah, academic theories are made so that we can come up with hypotheses and then scientifically test those hypotheses. That's been done and that research is ongoing. But why this model matters to us, to the people that are attending this webinar or listening to the recording of this webinar, is that this is not just a way to conceptualize it. This is a way for us to figure out where we can intervene. This is a tool that can actually save lives if we listen to it and follow the guidance. It tells us that we might be able to act early and often to effectively reduce risk factors. And so we're going to talk about that. We don't have a magic pill. We don't have something that's going to make this disappear, right? But we may be able to influence individual suicide risk by targeting specific baseline and acute risk factors. We honestly we struggled with this slide a little bit. I've done a lot of suicide prevention training and a lot of employee assistance program training. And when we say collapse is not inevitable, we do not mean that every suicide could have been prevented or that every suicide will be prevented. That's not what we mean. We just mean that the complete collapse is not a foregone conclusion. If somebody is shaking and somebody is at high risk and they get hit by a strong storm, there are still things that can be done. Timely and targeted interventions to actually stabilize the structure, if we're going to go, with that analogy. And it's just important for us to all to remember, most people don't actually want to die. They do want their suffering to stop. And so giving people that hope that their suffering can and will stop, I think is going to be key. So let's talk about the early interventions a little bit more. So we're going to talk a little bit about the baseline risk factors that are amenable to change. And like I said, we're not talking about your genetic makeup, but we are talking about things that are susceptible to change. And so this is the preparation before the storm hits. And it's incumbent upon all of us to really think about this stuff and try to figure out how we can shore up our own structures as well as the structures of those people around us, right? And so early interventions that promote health and wellness, that increase resiliency. There are so many studies out there that show that management supervisory style can directly impact staff members' resilience to trauma, and I'm talking horrendous trauma. There is social support, there's cognitive coping skills, there's training out there, there's formal treatment, and one of the things we're going to talk about is the importance of a positive work culture in reducing those baseline risks. So specific to public safety professionals, I don't know if you guys know this, but there's a pretty pronounced tendency for corrections and other public safety professionals to be in complete denial, at least outwardly, of the problems they are experiencing, right? For a myriad of reasons. They will tell you all day long, I'm good, I'm good, I'm good. But if we take the time to truly listen to them, you can see that they're anything but good. There is a code of silence. There is a stigma to reaching out for help. We're breaking through it, but it takes everybody to keep pushing in that direction. We want to counter sort of this sense of false resilience. And it's an interesting concept. This doesn't matter what I went through. I'm tough. I've been there before. I'm going to rub some dirt on it and get back in there. Right. And this, I'm going to pretend that I'm strong and good because I'm afraid of the stigma of showing that I'm not good and that I'm broken, right? And so what that does is A, it makes it unlikely people are going to reach out for help. But B, it spreads the culture that you cannot reach out for help and you can get through it on your own. I'm here to tell you, the research tells us that's just not true. False resilience can actually harm your ability to weather storms. Um, we need to promote self-care and we need to promote seeking help, right? It's not enough just to say it. We need to actively promote it. And we're going to talk about that at the very end of the presentation when we talk about the difference between words and actions. But that's what we're doing. If we can figure out a way to create a healthy workforce culture as opposed to a toxic workforce culture, those can actually become long-term protective environmental factors, right? There are a whole bunch of variables we can't control, right? Across the nation, there is a corrections staffing crisis. There is very little any one individual on this training, listening to this, or listening to the recording can do to solve that. So what I'm going to challenge you is what can you do as an individual within your sphere of influence to turn the tide in a more positive direction? What can you do? Is it helpful to constantly focus on and complain something you can't change? Or is it more helpful to look at what you can change? Look at the way you do interact. If we get enough people doing that, that will promote a healthy workforce culture. If you are a person who likes to fish, you may understand this analogy, and if you're not, this may fall flat. But I liken it to salmon swimming upstream, right? So if you don't know this, salmon have this weird habit of swimming against the current of the river to go upstream, and that's where they procreate and do their thing and they spawn and all that. If one salmon is just jumping alone up that river, um, just trust me, physics wise, it's not going to work. That river will sweep that fish all the way down the river. He will never make it. She will never make it. But if you have enough salmon swimming upstream, research has shown they can actually change the flow of the river. That's what we're talking about. If we can have enough people controlling what they can control and spreading that positivity and not tolerating the toxicity, we can actually change the flow of a river. That's a heavy lift, right? But we've got to start somewhere. And so we'll talk about that as we move forward. Notice, act, support, and I would argue, when necessary, refer. Right. So this is our intervention strategy. If we're going to continue with the analogy, we need to spot the termites, right? We need to understand not just, these static, unchangeable genetic factors. We need to be able to understand if there's an unhealthy workforce culture in my environment. And we need to ask the hard question. If it's there, is it contributing to long-term suicide risk? We need to spot whether or not there is a glorification of poor coping strategies, right? Hey, you know what? If you've had a hard shift, we meet in the parking lot every evening with a Yeti cooler full of beer and we process our things. Um, Not necessarily the healthiest coping strategy, especially if it becomes long term. Spot the termites and be brave enough to point them out and ask for change, right? This is what we're talking about in terms of reinforcing before the storm hits. What preventative steps can you make to target cognitive, emotional, physiological, and behavioral problems, right? A, Whether you're an administrator and maybe you rethink the notion that alcohol has to be an integral part of every single promotion celebration. Maybe just rethink this whole notion that you guys are tough and we don't need to talk about your problems because you don't have any problems, right? Maybe we get rid of that traditional toxic masculinity that can be seen in corrections and other first responder environments. And instead figure out how we can actually promote a supportive work culture. training employees to recognize and respond to storms. All right. So this is the agency has to have policy and it has to have training and it has to have, just like we have to have, whether you call it a SORT team, a SWAT team, some sort of lethal option that's an emergency response, or you have, like we do in the federal system, also a sort of less lethal response team that's your disturbance control team. You also need a way to respond to these storms that consider not just the physical safety of your employees, but the emotional and mental and cognitive safety of those employees, right? And so that's appropriately training peer support teams. That's appropriately training all of your staff for how to recognize when somebody might be struggling. We're not asking people to be psychologists or counselors. We're asking you to be good coworkers. We're asking those of you who are leaders to be good leaders. And that means we have to take the time and we have to put in the effort to develop these skills. So whether you're supervisory or you are non-supervisory, and this is just, with your coworkers, how do you actually engage in empathetic listening? Right? Ooh, big, those are feelings. We don't talk about feelings. Well, yeah, we do. We just need to get better at listening to people about their feelings. Being non-judgmental. We're all going through stuff. We've all gone through stuff. My guess is none of us are experiencing anything that hasn't been dealt with by somebody before. Allowing someone to express what they're feeling and what they're struggling with without judging them, right? That means without poo-pooing it or just putting it off to the side. You're going to be fine. You're going to get through this just fine. That's not always helpful. That's not always what people want to hear. But teaching people how to give this empathy and non-judgmental support, it's a very useful skill set. And if we're going to switch modes and talk about supervisors real quick, plenty of studies out there that show that certain supervisory styles, specifically these relational interactive supervisory styles, breed trauma resiliency and lessen the impact. They also, ironically, increase retention and people's willingness to continue to work in these environments. So know what your resources are, know what resources are available to you locally. What do you have? What do you have available for your people, right? Whether it's peer support team that is sponsored by your agency, whether it is mental health professionals in the community, whether you start a database of mental health professionals in the community that are adept at working with first responders, because we are a unique cultural phenomenon. And I would argue that having somebody who culturally understands us is probably not a bad idea. But pulling those resources together and having those available for your staff. This last one on this slide, knowing when and how to escalate. Does your agency have a policy? Do you guys talk about when is it time to escalate a concern? I hate to be this blunt about it, but man, I would much rather somebody be very, very, very upset with me for trying to get them help if I thought they needed it, than show up for work or get a text at home and find out that someone took their life. So, if you don't have these conversations routinely with your administration, with your staff, up and down the chain of command about when and how to escalate, right? If you have concerns about somebody, do you know who to go to? Who's your go-to person? Who do they go to? What's the process? So put some thought into that and how that looks in your environment and your agency. It never ceases to amaze me when we go out and talk to corrections professionals and we do training and people don't know who to tell. Well, I would tell my lieutenant. Well, who would they tell? And then there's a big stammering, right? And more common than knowing who and well to tell, they just sort of hide it and they try to handle it themselves. So know when, right? If you notice somebody shaking and you notice that they appear to be teetering, don't don't let them fall. escalate that concern to somebody who can actually get them help. We already talked about this briefly. Have agency policies regarding intervening in a crisis. If you have something like a peer support team, congratulations. I hope they are well trained. I suspect they are probably well trained in critical incident response and things of that nature. But how well are they at how well trained are they at listening to somebody whose spouse just informed them that they left them and they took their kids? How well trained are they at handling sort of the non-correctional things? And that's just something to consider, right? The bottom line is, and I probably should have addressed this at the beginning, but this topic is so vast and so wide, it's hard to get all of this in, right? A lot of times we don't notice the shaking at work. A lot of times we notice the shaking because problems occur at home, and then eventually they bring it to work. One of the first trainings I did since renewing my relationship with Desert Waters was doing corrections fatigue to fulfillment training for trainers class. And one of our most experienced instructors, if not our most experienced instructor, Brent, it said something that it just resonated with me, and it's just I'd never conceptualized it this way. And he basically said, we save our best selves for work. And when we put that uniform on and we go to work and we put on that false exterior that everything is fine and we save our best self for work. So where does the shaking show up if it's not at work, if someone's struggling? You see it at home, right? And that can manifest in some things at work. Somebody is suddenly, chronically late when they never were. Somebody is suddenly more disheveled than they never were, right? So, having a well-trained workforce to recognize those things and get those people the referrals they need to stabilize those shakings. So intervene to lessen these sort of acute factors. And by the time you notice shaking, my guess is immediate crisis stabilization and get those people referred to professionals for help. I mean, that's kind of the track we're going on there. These are resources that may or may not be available within your agency, within your group. These are